So welcome at my talk. I'm going to talk about putting your APIs in the hands of millions of developers. My name is Laskewitz and I'm a senior cloud advocate at Microsoft. And I work mostly with the Power Platform, which you can see at the top left corner. The Power Platform is a low-code platform within Microsoft, and it has tons of products in its platform. And I'm going to talk mostly about connectors today, because that's the way you can connect your APIs with the Power Platform. But first, let's talk a little bit about the Power Platform. The Power Platform is a low-code, no-code platform that has been used all around the world already at lots of customers. And it consists of a bunch of apps. It has Power Apps. So that's one of the first products, and probably the most famous one, together with Power BI. And that's the product that can help you build apps. It can create apps that you can kind of pixel perfectly design as well. And you can also create apps that are more based on data. Next we have Power Automate, and that's for the process automation. You can use Power Automate for API automation as well as UI automation. So if you're interested in RPA, for instance, that's something that's also part of Power Automate. Then we have Power BI, which is the analytics tool within the Power Platform. And that will enable you to connect with all kinds of data sources and then create beautiful analytics for that. Copilot Studio is the most recent addition to the Power Platform, and that used to be called Power Virtual Agents, and it's a way to build chatbots. So Microsoft has a thing called Copilot. I don't know if you know about it, but it's basically their kind of thing to create chatbots. So they have all kinds of Copilots within their products, and those are chatbots where you can create all kinds of things with. And Copilot Studio is a way to create your own Copilot, but you can also extend the out-of-the-box Copilots that are already available. And next we have Power Pages, and that's the tool that can help you with creating websites. So whenever you have, for instance, a customer portal, and you want customers to log into a website and then act upon their, for instance, their orders or something like that, you can do that with Power Pages. And below all the products, we have a bunch of supporting parts of the Power Platform. And I'm going to only talk about the first one, because that's the data connectors. And that helps you connect you to your APIs. The other ones are also very important, but not really relevant to this presentation. So if we dive into the data connectors, a connector is basically a connection between the Power Platform and an API. So what you can do then is you can, whenever you have your own API, for instance, you can create a connector, and that way people in the Power Platform can use all those products that I just showed on the screen, and they can create an app connecting to your API. So it's really easy to use those connectors together with other APIs. And it's based on a formal definition of a REST API. I don't know how many of you know OpenAPI, but that's basically the definition that we use for connectors. And on top of that, we also have extensions on that to make sure that it works really well with the Power Platform, because it's a bit of a different UI. So we also want to make sure that the people that are using your connector, that they have a really good experience. And I'm going to show more of that later. When you have a connector, you can use it within the Power Platform, and most specifically in the Power Apps, Power Automate products, and in Azure Logic Apps, which is another product outside of the Power Platform. But it shows that you only have to develop a connector once, and you can enable it for multiple products. So that's a really nice thing. We already have 1,200 plus connectors in the platform. So there are already tons of different products that are available inside of the platform, like SAP, ServiceNow, Salesforce. There's a whole bunch of products that we can use within the Power Platform already. And as you can see on the right side, the connector is basically an open API definition, an API properties file, which gives you a little bit more information about the connector, and the binary file for the icon, and that together is basically a connector. We already have 1,200 plus connectors. There are a bunch of logos above. As you can see, there are tons of different products that already have a connector. But sometimes when you are working with the Power Platform, you want to have another connector that's not yet available. And that's where you can build your own custom connectors. And yeah, you can have a couple of reasons to create your own connectors. The first one is when one of the 1,200 plus connectors is not your API that you want to use, then you can create a custom connector, of course. Sometimes it's the case that one of your connectors that you want to use doesn't offer the functionality that you want. So within connectors, you have all kinds of operations, and those operations sometimes don't match what you want to do, basically. So you want to extend that connector. That's when you want to create an extra custom connector. They are pretty simple to build. I really want to emphasize, though, maintaining it can be harder because, of course, APIs change. So whenever there's a change in the API, you also should make sure that your connector is updated as well. So make sure to take that into account. You can build a connector really easily through the UI. I'm going to show that a little bit later. But you can also use a Postman collection, for instance, or just import an open API file. There are tons of possibilities there. And you can also share them, package them, and certify them through GitHub. And a little bit more on that later. When you build a connector, there are a bunch of steps that you need to go through. You need to make sure that you know the API very well that you want to build the connector for. And it sounds really obvious, but you really need to know what kind of operations you want to put into your connector, because people are going to use that connector inside of all those products that I just listed. So you should be helping them getting the right operations. When you want to build one, you have to start in one of the products. So you can start in Power Apps, Power Automate, or Logic Apps. You have to set up the authentication. You can use tons of types of authentication. You can use an API key, basic auth. You can use OAuth 2, for instance. There are tons of things that you can do. Then you need to define all the different operations for your connector. And you have two types of operations. You have triggers. And triggers can be really helpful when you, for instance, have something like you have an API where something gets updated. And then it should trigger something in the Power Platform, for instance. That's when you use a trigger. That could be a webhook, for instance, or a polling mechanism. And that's a trigger. The actions is what is happening next. So, for instance, a file gets changed inside of an API or something, and then it should trigger something else. It should send a message to an API or whatever. You can also add custom code if you want to. C# is currently supported, but in the future we will add more types of code in there. So probably JavaScript will also be one of them. And last but not least, you need to save and test your connector. Make sure to test your connector in multiple ways, because you can do a technical test in the custom connector experience where you can trigger and test all the different operations that you have. But you also want to test the experience for your low-code developers, because there are so many and they really want to have a good experience with your connector. So you need to try out that experience as well. There are a couple of connectors, types of connectors. The first one is a custom connector. And that's really helpful when you have a public or a private API. So when you have an API just for your company and you don't want to certify that and make that available to other people in the Power Platform, that's when you want to use a custom connector. It's really internal based, but this is also the starting point for the other two types, because you always need to start with a custom connector when you develop one. And then when you're done, you can download and certify it in the other two types as well. And that leads us to the next one, and that's a certified connector. A certified connector is basically a custom connector that you certify through Microsoft. And then after certification, when they have approved it, they will be available for all the products in the Power Platform. And everybody who will build a Power App, for instance, will be able to use your API through that connector. At least when they have an account to log in, for instance, because they still need to authenticate, of course. The big thing here with the certified connector is that only people that actually own the API can certify that connector. And that's why we also have a separate one, and that's an independent publisher connector. And that's the option where you can also certify a connector that is not owned by you. So the API is not owned by you. So I could, for instance, build a connector for X or for Facebook, and I could certify that as well, and that will be available for everyone in the Power Platform as well. But I've talked a lot with the slides, so let's move to a demo. So for this demo, I'm going to use a website called chucknorris.io, and chucknorris.io is a website where you can get Chuck Norris facts. And those are jokes about Chuck Norris being the strongest man in the world and he can destroy basically everything. And this API is an API where you don't have any authentication, that's not needed. And you can easily grab a random Chuck Norris joke and then you will get the response which is listed here. I already created that connector in the Power Platform, and this is the UI for custom connectors. You can create a connector and then you can add some details. You can upload a connector icon, for instance. You have a background color. You can add a description. You can set some details here for the host URL, for instance. And that's basically it for the general part. In security, you can set up the authentication. You can set it to no authentication, basic authentication, an API key, or OAuth 2. In this case, we're only going to use the no authentication. And now we get into the meat of the connector, and that's the definition part. And this is where you kind of create all the different operations that you want within your connector. So at the left side, you can see that I have 3 different actions. I have one that is for the get random Chuck Norris fact. I have one for getting the Chuck Norris fact categories. And I have a search for Chuck Norris facts operation. If you look at these operations, you can have a summary, and this is basically what people see when they use it in the Power Platform. So when they want to add this action to their environment, they can search for get random Chuck Norris fact, for instance, and they can select that and add that to their workflow if they want to. It has a description so that people really know what it does. And you also have an operation ID. There are a bunch of different settings in here which are available. There usually is a learn more link behind it. So if you don't know what that certain thing does, click on the learn more link and you will see a docs page where you can find all the details about that certain thing. But let's scroll a little bit down and we talk about the request. When you normally create your custom connector, you can start with a request and you can just import from a sample. So you can select the operation, what kind of verb it is. So if it's a get or a post or a put or whatever. You can add the URL, you can add some headers, and you can even use a body if you want to. And then you can save that and it will import that into the connector. The other part is the response, so you can also have responses, and in this case I have the 200 response in here, and this is basically all the things that I get back from the API. And again, you can use the import from sample and then just put the example from the website, for instance, inside of this, this import, and that way it's really easy to make this happen. And when you're done with those actions, you can also add a new thing called an AI plugin, and that makes it possible to use this connector also in a Copilot. But for now, we're not going to focus on that that much, but this is a way how you can make it an AI plugin in Copilot. You can add code, custom code. I already talked about that a little bit. You can use C# code if you want to for instance, transform the response or the request if you want to. And last but not least, we have the test part. And here you can basically test your API or your calls. So here I can, for instance, hit test operation and it will test my connector. And it shows that we already have a Chuck Norris fact that we'll get into here. And I can also add a category if I want to. And this is really important because this is basically the technical test. And I also told you that there is a possibility to test it in the product. And that will give you a different experience. So let me show you that as well. Because I have a Power Automate workflow here that I just created before this session. And what it does, it can run on demand and it can grab a Chuck Norris joke. It doesn't do something very special. But what you can see here is how the connector behaves in Power Automate. And we can see here that when I click the Get Random Chuck Norris Fact, that we have a bunch of parameters. And that was the category that you also saw in the test panel here. But what you can see here is that you have a drop down here with all the categories. And you might remember from the step before that we also had an action called Get Categories. And you can actually combine those different operations so that it's way more useful for the people that are using your connector to use that within the Power Platform. Because if you just have a simple input box, people should know every category that's out there. And now you have a list of categories and you can just select it. And when you are done, you can just save it and you can test it in the product as well. So if it's done with saving, come on, there we go. I can test it and I can run it. There we go. And it should run. And here you can see that it ran and that I should get some response. Here I got a response. And the response is Chuck Norris insists on strongly typed programming languages. So that's one of the jokes that comes back from that. So this is how you can actually create those connectors. Come on. There we go. So one thing I would love you to do is to get started. We have a developer environment that you can use. So when you go to aka.ms/pp/get-started, you can create your own developer environment in the Power Platform. And that way you can already use the custom connectors as well. It's free of charge, so you can just use that. And then you can build your own connectors if you want to for your own APIs. Resources, I have a bunch of resources here for the docs and how to get it certified. I also added a Power Platform Connectors GitHub repository. And that's a repository that shows you all the connectors that are already there. So if you want to learn more about how certain connectors work, you can just copy and paste because nobody wants to do the same thing all the time. I'm kind of a lazy developer, so I kind of like to get stuff from other experiences as well. There's also the Extended Open API definition docs article, and that will help you with all the different types of fields that you have within the connector experience, and that also shows some tips and tricks around it. You have coding standards, and you also have a CLI, because I only use the UI, but you can also use it within Visual Studio Code and then, for instance, deploy the connector through a CLI. With that, I want to thank you for your attention, and if you want to connect, you can connect with me through that URL. Thank you.